Okay, we're getting started here in Module 5. We're going to take a look at indigenous governance. And one of the things that we have to take a look at is a comparison between Western governance and indigenous governance, primarily because simply describing indigenous governance doesn't really give us a sense of how things are unless we understand how it really contrasts very basic on a very basic philosophical level and on a very practical level from Western governance. So what we're going to do here for three lessons is a discussion of Western governance, and then the last two lessons will be discussing aspects of indigenous governance. The slide that's in front of you right now is called Roots of Western Governance, and what it is an attempt to provide some kind of a view of the history of Western government or governance. And like I say there, it's very far oversimplified. But it is a historical timeline that kind of gives us an idea. And just because what I see as limitations within PowerPoint and the ability to get this posted, there's some things here that I'm just going to have to speak about, but it's not written down. And so let's start here with the Greek philosophers. About 23 to 2400 years ago, BCE, before current era. And when we talk about the Greek philosophers, primarily we're talking about Aristotle as kind of the person who wrote about the idea of politics. And in fact, that's the name of the book. But he also wrote on ethics and some other things, quite a few other things, the physical world. And so he was one of the first philosophers. And some of the things that he talked about there were ideal in his time. He was at a time when Greece was made up of what they call city-states. Each city was a state unto itself. And a lot of the things, like I said, a lot of things he wanted to talk about was kind of an ideal situation, but at the same time he gave some thought to this, and this is the beginnings of what we now consider Western governance. So for example, during this time, the primary way of creating wealth was through slavery. And so in order to justify this, Aristotle had this concept of people who are born to be slaves and people who are citizens. And he also so this begins this whole discussion of citizenship, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the future here. He also identified the idea of government being made up of three parts: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. We call that separation of powers. That's another thing that we'll be talking about. And so Greece kind of lays down this philosophical idea of what government and governance ought to be, although a lot of their values were not picked up later until after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire and the beginnings of the modern state. Then people began to look back at Greece, because the time had come for some of the idealized concepts that Aristotle had, that the situation on the ground was such that they could begin to apply those. Then we move to the Roman Empire, which is about 2,000 years ago, give or take a couple 300 years on each side of 2,000 years ago. And basically what the Roman Empire did was expand the influence well, I would say expand the influence. What it did is it unified pretty much all of Western Europe, North Africa, and Middle East under the control of Roman Empire. And during the process of doing that, of course, they laid the basis for, they fought with the various tribes of Europe. And so in fighting with those tribes and defeating those tribes, they laid the groundwork for other kinds of forms of government and forms of economics that were to come. But the main thing is they unified this huge area from England over to France and Germany and Austria and Switzerland and into Eastern Europe to a certain degree, into Bulgaria and Romania, down into Turkey and the Middle East, and across North Africa, then over to the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and that all got tied into the Roman Empire. So when the Roman Empire actually fell and was taken over, it was taken over and replaced with what they call the Holy Roman Empire. And that is basically that the former territories, or the former territory of the Roman Empire, was kind of turned over to the church to a large degree. The emperor was replaced by the pope, but the pope wasn't really interested in running the kind of empire that Rome had had. So one of the things that they began to do was to establish, during the period of what we call the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, they began to establish countries or kingdoms, and the kings of those kingdoms received their authority to govern the kingdoms from the from the Pope. Excuse me. And this is pretty much how the Holy Roman Empire began to establish. It's kind of like the breakup of the Roman Empire, but it's done in such a way that it still remained unified under the Pope, under the Catholic Church. Well, as that process moved forward, we ended up with each of these different countries becoming each of these different kingdoms, I guess you'd say, amalgamating or joining themselves into forming countries. And by the time, let me back up and say this Holy Roman Empire period is also a period of time, what we call the feudal time, where you had the king owning all of the land in the country, and he had the people that worked for him directly as tax collectors in his court and his army, and the princes and barons and all these people who were squires and knights and all these kinds of things that we come to know from the movies. But most of the people were serfs, and they didn't really own the land. What they'd do is they got to live on the land as long as they paid rent or taxes to the king, and as long as they paid their tithe to the church, they got to stay on the land. Well, the Holy Roman Empire began to fall apart in a sense because of some changes, and the primary change was the development of the Protestant religion. Martin Luther comes along and challenges certain aspects of the theology of the Catholic Church, and in doing so, he begins to set up the basis for these so-called kingdoms to break away from the Pope or from the Church, and began to have authority either based on their own national religion, such as the Church of England, or the beginning of what we now call a secular state, meaning that religion isn't the basis for authority in the country. And about that same time, we had this worldwide colonization effort, so a tremendous amount of wealth began to pour into Western Europe, particularly in those countries that owned colonies. And as that began to happen, then some changes came about, and we have what we now call the modern state. And the modern state is pretty much exemplified by what we call liberal thought, meaning that you get to elect that the leaders of a country are chosen by popular election and not appointed by the Pope or somebody else. And that international trade is a positive thing. And that there's just a number of things that have come about as a result of the modern state. The modern state often is organized along the lines that were first identified with Aristotle, absent the natural slave concept. So the ideas he had about the household, ideas he had about the separation of powers in government and the role of the legislature and the municipalities and the judicial branches, all of those things have been largely incorporated into most of the modern state apparatus today. The modern state is exemplified by capitalism. And so when you look back, you see Greek philosophers, Roman Empire, those guys were pretty much exemplified by slavery as being the primary method of creating wealth. The Holy Roman Empire was pretty much exemplified by the feudal system as a way of creating wealth. And the modern state is pretty much based in mercantilism and capitalism. So that's kind of the overview, a very far simplified overview, but it gives you an idea that there's been a development over a period of a couple of thousand years with some very basic concepts of governance. And so that's the end of part one.